Hello, this is Professor James Strickler. This is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 3, American Federalism, and it's Lesson 16 about New Federalism. In this lesson, you'll learn about the Reagan Revolution, about New Federalism, about the United States Supreme Court case of United States versus Lopez, another case, United States versus Morrison, and about the impact that New Federalism had on federalism. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan became the most prominent political figure in America. And he brought a certain attitude with him to the office. And that attitude can be seen in this quote and one on the next slide. Here, he's speaking during his first inaugural address after being elected president in 1980. And notice that he, as the leader of the United States government, says that government is the problem, not the solution. So this is a basic attitude that he has as a leader, that there's too much government in people's lives, and that we need to roll it back and scale it down. Now, this is quite a dramatic change for people in the national government to want to be reducing their powers. Here's another quote from him that shows just how intense he was in this view. Here, during a press conference in 1986, he said that the most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government, and I'm here to help." Now, why would that be terrifying? Because Ronald Reagan pretty much assumed that the government is bad at most of what it does, and that's why it needs to leave people alone. It's sort of a classical liberal point of view, if you can recall that from earlier in the course. Now, not entirely. Reagan would have called himself a conservative, not a classical liberal. But it's the idea that the big government programs, like the New Deal and the Great Society, that were put in place by modern liberals, need to be removed, at least scaled back, toned down, that they're trying to do too much. And by trying to do too much, they're actually harming people and their freedoms. Now, Reagan wasn't just a lone voice with this attitude in the 1980s. When he was elected president in 1980, he swept into office overwhelmingly. He won 45 of the 50 states and won by almost 9 million votes in the popular vote. Then when he was reelected in 1984, he won 49 of the 50 states. The only state he lost was the home state of his opponent, Walter Mondale. And he won all the electoral votes in the country except for those of Minnesota, Walter Mondale's home state, and those from the District of Columbia. So overwhelming victories when he ran for president. And the reason to recognize that is to show that his attitude about the national government having gotten too big and needing to be scaled back was an attitude that was broadly accepted and supported in the country at the time. This new attitude then became known as the Reagan Revolution, as he came into office and tried to change the nature of the national government and thereby change the nature of American federalism as it had evolved up to that point. This overall attitude of trying to scale back the national government, return power to the states, became known as New Federalism. The idea of New Federalism was to halt the transformation of our federal system into a unitary system where the national government would be preeminent in everything, and even if possible to restore power back to the states that the national government had claimed from them. One way to do this, which was championed by Ronald Reagan and somewhat was carried out by the Congress when he was president, was a notion of de-evolution or devolution. In other words, evolving backwards. So the national government had evolved to have great power at the cost of state power. And Ronald Reagan wanted to devolve that. In other words, to restore the power back to the states as much as possible. And one of the ways that he wanted to do it, a particular prominent way, was through what are called block grants. So instead of the national government collecting a bunch of money in taxes and then setting up a bunch of programs which they are going to run themselves and tell everybody else what to do, which was the model for the New Deal and the Great Society, instead, what Ronald Reagan wanted the national government to do was to take that money they collected and turn around and hand it to the states and say, okay, there's a problem in the country that needs to be addressed. But instead of the national government trying to figure out the right way to address it and just telling everybody else what to do, we're going to hand you this chunk of money. Now, that chunk of money is specifically for this problem, whatever it is, but you go spend it the way you think is best to deal with that problem. So it was seen as a way to restore decision-making back to the state level. But we have to recognize where the money is still coming from and who ultimately controls it. While this was an attempt to restore more power to the states, in a way it's doing it with the national government still in charge. Because the national government is the one that holds the money, is then giving it to the states. And because of that, the states, in a sense, aren't really free to do what they want. Because the national government could decide tomorrow to take the money away, no longer supply it. Or they could decide to attach strings to it in the future of, oh, you have to do this and that in order to get the money. So as long as the national government is still the source of the money that the states are using, the states, even when they're the ones administering the money, deciding for themselves what to do, ultimately national power is still preeminent. Another way that Ronald Reagan tried to change federalism in America was through his appointments to the United States Supreme Court. While he was president, he had the opportunity to appoint 4 justices to the Supreme Court, a new Chief Justice and 3 associate justices. Now, the Supreme Court's made up of 9 people, so appointing 4 new justices can possibly dramatically swing the balance of power on the court. So the court that Ronald Reagan, in a sense, created ended up rendering decisions in a couple of cases that dramatically changed the trajectory of American federalism. The first of those was a decision in what's known as the gun-free First of those was a case dealing with a law called the Gun-Free School Zones Act. In that case, what happened was there was a young man who was searched outside of a school in Texas, and it was discovered that he had a gun in his backpack. He was then charged with a crime under this Gun-Free School Zones Act, which was a federal law, a law passed by the national government that made it a crime for a person to carry a gun within a certain distance of a school. Now, please be careful here to recognize what I'm saying is happening. The national government is passing a law to say that people can't have guns near local schools. Now, what power would they have claimed in the Constitution would allow them to do that? Well, hopefully you'll begin to recognize this from previous lessons, that since the time of the New Deal and the Great Society, just about any time the national government claims power to do anything affecting private behavior, particularly private behavior at the local level, they will claim that it's justified under the Commerce Clause. Well, how would they justify that in this case? Well, the argument they made was that having guns near a school threatens the educational process, which leads to a less productive citizenry, which then leads to economic inefficiency, particularly in interstate commerce. Now, here's a quote on this page from the Lopez case talking about this, but you can probably better understand the argument of the government, the argument of Congress of why they could pass this law, if we kind of diagram it out a little bit. So the argument is that if somebody like Lopez is allowed to have a gun outside of a school, that then gun violence will take place near the school, because it won't just be Lopez out there with a gun, other people will show up with guns too. And then that will frighten students, not just at that school, but other schools where guns are allowed near them too. The frightened students, which at this point you're hypothesizing are all over the country, will then be poorly educated because they're afraid to go to school, afraid to learn. Because they're poorly educated, they'll then get worse jobs. And because they get worse jobs, they'll then make less money. And because they make less money, they'll make fewer purchases of products and services. And in that way, less interstate commerce will happen because they'll be buying fewer things that have been shipped in from other states. So what effectively Congress is claiming when they pass a law like this is that by allowing guns outside of school, you are harming commerce among the states. And therefore, it's necessary and proper, in their view, to protect the commerce among the states to make sure that somebody can't stand outside of a school with a gun in their hand. Now, consider this from the point of view of Lopez. Lopez, who gets arrested with his gun, who's told that he is endangering interstate commerce, can counter by saying, but wait a minute, I'm just standing there with a gun. I'm not engaged in buying or selling anything. Nothing is crossing state lines. How can the fact that I'm standing with a gun in a certain place be harming commerce among the states? Well, as the Supreme Court considered this argument, what they realized was if they accept the government's reasoning, that long chain of reasoning getting from Lopez standing outside a school with a gun to interstate commerce being harmed, that effectively they're endorsing a line of reasoning that would allow Congress to regulate anything. And after realizing that, the Supreme Court also pointed out that merely standing there and possessing a gun is clearly not an economic act. And so if he's not actually engaged in any sort of economic thing that's influencing commerce, and allowing the government to regulate that would then allow them to regulate anything and everything, the Supreme Court finally decided that they couldn't stretch the Commerce Clause power any farther. To do so, in their minds, would create a general police power for the national government, which they said was something that the states were supposed to have. And so they said, while previous cases may have done this, the Supreme Court had precedents upholding the New Deal legislation and the Great Society legislation where they had stretched the Commerce Clause to the point where we had to actually consider in a previous lesson, does the national government have a police power now? The Supreme Court said, yeah, you've done that in the past, but we're not going to take it any farther. They finally said, enough is enough. We're not going to let you stretch the Commerce Clause any farther than you already have. So, this is a remarkable outcome. Truly remarkable, because since the Revolution of 1937, when the Supreme Court started upholding New Deal legislation, this was the first time, 58 years later, that the Supreme Court had ever stepped in and ruled one of these congressional acts under the Commerce Clause to be unconstitutional. They'd upheld every single law passed by Congress, as long as Congress said Commerce Clause, for almost 60 years. But in the Lopez case, when they rendered this decision, it was only by a 5-4 vote. That means that there were 4 justices on the Supreme Court who were willing to follow that long chain of events to justify Congress's continued expansion of its power. But remarkably, for the first time in nearly 60 years, there were 5 justices who were willing to say no. Another case came up a few years later that involved actually a similar line of reasoning. This involved the Violence Against Women Act. The Violence Against Women Act was designed to allow women who had suffered violence because of their gender, they were attacked because they were women in some way, such as rape, to sue their attackers in federal court to try to recover money as compensation for whatever happened to them. Well, now, if you were to ask Congress, well, where do you get the power to justify women being able to sue their rapists in federal court? Where in the Constitution does it say that you can outlaw such a thing? They would, of course, say Commerce Clause, as we've learned. So let's look at what their reasoning would be to say that this is something that falls under the Commerce Clause. So we begin with the idea that, well, what if we don't pass a law that makes people liable to be sued in court for having raped someone, for example? What if there is no law passed by the federal government that would do that? In other words, no Violence Against Women Act. Well, Congress reasoned then there'd be less incentive for rapists to avoid raping because they wouldn't be held economically liable. They wouldn't have to pay money if they get caught. And so as a consequence, there'd be more sexual assaults, which would lead to women that are frightened and have low self-esteem and things like that because they're either getting raped or always worried about getting raped, which will then lead to them being poorly educated and getting worse careers than they would otherwise have, which then leads them to lower incomes, which then leads to them making fewer purchases, which then leads to less interstate commerce. So it's essentially the same line of reasoning as the Lopez case, that they have to make men liable for rape in federal court. Otherwise, commerce among the states will be hindered. When the Supreme Court considered this decision again, they said, well, wait a minute. This is the kind of thing that falls under the police powers of the states. And it's a thing that is not related to any actual economic action. Raping someone is not an act of commerce. And so for that reason, they decide that this is beyond, again, the power of the national government. Now, it's not beyond the power of government. They said, yes, there should be a remedy to this. There should be some way for a woman who's been sexually assaulted to sue her attacker, to get money as compensation. But that remedy should come from the state, not from the national government, because the national government's a government of limited enumerated powers, and the states have general police power. So what does this then do to the balance of power between the national government and the states? Well, this is how our diagram looked after we talked about the rights revolution. And we had to wonder whether there's any power even left to the state governments that the national government doesn't have supremacy over. Well, this line of cases, the Lopez and the Morrison case, essentially erected what we can call the Lopez wall around the national government and said, okay, there's a point beyond which you've gone too far. There are some things that have to be left to the states to do, such as prosecuting local criminal laws concerning things like gun possession and rape and stuff like that. Now, this movement toward new federalism for things like devolution of power through block grants and the Supreme Court decisions in Lopez and Morrison may have had the effect of arresting the growth of national power. Hey, we aren't going to try to take on new responsibilities for the government. Instead, we're going to give the money back to the states. Or, hey, states, there are areas that you really can regulate without the national government stepping in, such as gun possession around a school or violence against women or whatever it may be. But even though the new federalism seemed to stop the national government from growing in its power, it did not roll back the powers that the government already had. So in that sense, maybe it wasn't as successful as Ronald Reagan and the other supporters of it would have hoped. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. Why was Reagan's election called a revolution? Was it because Republicans had finally won the presidency? Was it because national powers increased? Was it because New Deal programs expanded? Or is it because big government had become the enemy? It's because big government had become the enemy. Remember, before this, in the New Deal and the Great Society programs, big government was being greatly expanded to create all these programs to try to help you. Now Reagan is saying, no, they've gone too far. We need to roll them back. Which is a characteristic of new federalism? Is it that it added a bunch of constitutional amendments? That it devolved power back to the states via block grants? That it nationalized health care? Or that it created new welfare programs? Of course, a characteristic is the devolution of power through block grants. Why is the United States versus Lopez a remarkable case? Was it because a Commerce Clause law was overturned? Because gun violence increased? Because a state gun law was struck down? Or because agricultural quotas were upheld? Lopez was remarkable because a Commerce Clause law was overturned, in other words, struck down by the Supreme Court for the first time in almost 60 years. What law was at issue in the case of United States versus Morrison? Was it the Gun-Free School Zones Act, the Violence Against Women Act, the Product Safety Act, or the Fair Labor Act? It was the Violence Against Women Act. And then how did Reagan change federalism? Did he change it because national power grew? National power decreased? National growth of power was slowed? Or that state power decreased? Reagan changed federalism because the growth of national power slowed down during his presidency. But he was unable to restore power back to the states in the real sense, constitutional sense that he had wanted to do. Okay, that does it for lesson 16. Our next lesson in Unit 3 will be lesson 17, the last lesson of Unit 3, and it will deal with the current state of American federalism.